Welcome everyone to this episode of Talking Foreign Affairs with Adil Cader. In today's episode, we are honored to be joined by someone who really needs no introduction, someone who has served in the most influential roles in global diplomacy or won numerous awards for his service, Ambassador Robert Zoellick. Bob Zoellick is currently Senior Counsel at Brunswick Group and is Senior Fellow with the Belfer Center at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Mr. Zoellick previously served as President of the World Bank, U.S. Deputy Secretary of State, Under-Secretary of State, and U.S. Trade Representative. He's also served various senior roles in the Treasury as well as the White House. This is in addition to his illustrious career in the private sector. Ambassador Zoellick is a recipient of the Distinguished Service Award, the State Department's highest honor, the Alexander Hamilton Award from the Treasury Department, and the Medal for Distinguished Public Service of the Department of Defense. The German government awarded him the Knight Commander's Cross for his achievements in the course of German unification. The Mexican and Chilean governments awarded him their highest honors for non-citizens, the Aztec Eagle, and the Order of Merit. Given Mr. Zoellick's remarkable experience and achievements, trying to fit his career into a single episode was quite a difficult task. In reality, we probably need about 10 episodes to even touch the surface of his career. However, given the release of his latest book, America in the World, A History of U.S. Diplomacy and Foreign Policy, we'll be focusing on that for the first half of the session. And on the second half of the session, we'll be focusing on highlights of his career. His book has already got highly rated reviews from some of the most recognizable names in global diplomacy, and I would highly recommend getting a copy, having got the ebook myself. The link to purchase will be available in the video description. Ambassador Zoellick, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, Adil, and thank you for that generous introduction.
Now let's start off with your book. What motivated you to write such a book?
So when I was in government, I often drew upon history as I was trying to think through problems. So part of my purpose was to try to encourage others, particularly those of coming generations. As people who would listen to this cast would know, many foreign policy courses these days focus on international relations theories. And while they're interesting to study and debate, I found them of limited use when I was dealing with issues such as German unification or trade strategies or China policy or Darfur or other topics. And instead, what I wanted to focus on with this book is both the reality and my reading of history, which is efforts to solve problems in practical ways. Now, some people have probably read Henry Kissinger's book, Diplomacy, which came out in the 90s, which focused on history as a window on foreign policy. But knowing Dr. Kissinger, it tends to reflect more of the European realpolitik tradition. So in this book, I wanted to use stories to talk about some of the American experience and the portfolio of ideas of American diplomacy. And I suppose one other purpose was, in those various jobs you mentioned, I often had younger colleagues, and perhaps I used to torture them a little bit by asking historical questions because I had no idea what they had learned in school. And I discovered insofar as they learned history, it tended to be from World War II on. So I wanted to focus on some of the early periods because there's some fascinating people that I wanted to recall from the mists of time. And I guess the last thing, Adil, was that when I've talked about the book with some university audiences, I've been encouraged that perhaps after people had their fill of critical studies, there's a certain optimism that one can get about history offering insights on how to do better as opposed to timeless obstacles.
I really was intrigued by your point on how a lot of contemporary study of the history of U.S. foreign policy just focuses on that post-World War II period. That's certainly been the experience on the units I took in university in Australia on the history of U.S. foreign policy. Now, going back all the way to the beginning, can you just briefly explain the impact some of the founding fathers have had on foreign policy?
Well, starting with Alexander Hamilton, or really from the very beginning, you had sort of a period where you had Thomas Jefferson and with the politics of the French Revolution, combining with sort of Washington and Hamilton trying to hold the country together. Hamilton explores, and I discuss this in the book, what really amounts to a form of early partnership with Britain, where the United States, although it had won its independence, would fit within the British trading system. But in a sense, and Lord Shelburne, who is the British Prime Minister at the time, had a similar notion, but both of them are about 100 or more years ahead of their time. And so the United States develops a policy of neutrality, which is very practical from Hamilton's point of view. He needed trade to produce revenue, which was about 95, 97% of the revenue sources, in part to fund the government and, of course, to pay the interest on the debt. That concept of neutrality sticks with the United States all the way through World War I, where people may recall when Woodrow Wilson enters World War I in 1917, after the war began in 1914, he actually does so as an associated power, not an allied power. And he struggles intellectually to justify this to the American people. He redefines the notion of neutrality into what today we would call an idea of collective security. And he tries to take American concepts like the Monroe Doctrine and tries to say these are how they would apply internationally. And then further building on this anxiety about alliances, George Washington had warned about no permanent alliances, Thomas Jefferson, no entangling alliances. The United States foreign policy for the first 140 or 150 years is really an effort to develop ideas of how to engage in the world without alliances, because they associate alliances with European balance of power and militarism and monarchies. And so some of those ideas are economic, some of them are based on international law traditions, some of them are based on sort of even the union, the notion of kind of federation among states. But then there's a sharp shift in 1947-49. And that's when the United States creates the international alliance system that most of us have sort of grown up or studied or sort of worked in, which persists to today. And another theme, I suppose, that kind of goes back from the founding fathers, which a lot of historians ignore, is the importance of North America. Australians have their own continent, but we're the only two countries that actually either control or dominate a continent. And that was no sure thing. And North American policy remains important for the United States today.
And you mentioned about the North American policy, and in your book, you outlined 5 principles on how U.S. foreign policy has been defined. Looking at the first tradition, as you mentioned, North America, looking at the recent U.S. activity in regards to dealings with NAFTA, the subsequent USMCA, how would we analyze the U.S.'s performance in this regard?
Well, it's an interesting point, because if you go on most websites for foreign policy institutes, you'll find studies of Europe and Asia, the Middle East, some Africa, Latin America, almost never anything about North America, which of course was the heart of American policy in the 19th century. And I argue was very important in the 20th century. We almost went to war again with Mexico in 1916 and 17. You have the Cuban Missile Crisis, the big nuclear showdown in the Caribbean. And then coming back to my experience, NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, was much more than a trade agreement. It was a recognition that the one-party state controlled by the PRI from the 20s and 30s in Mexico was breaking down at the end of the Cold War. And under that system, which was basically a corporatist politics, almost like Italy in the 1920s and 30s, the question of where would the institutions, courts, media, unions, businesses, where would they reattach themselves? And so NAFTA was really an effort to try to support Mexico's political and economic modernization by connecting Mexico to the United States. And for people that have an international perspective on this, it's important to recognize that given the history of North America, Mexico, Canada, and the US were all quite sensitive about their sovereignty and independence. So it was an effort to integrate while respecting sovereignty and independence. And note the difference of that with the European Union model, which was an effort to have a shared sovereignty. That would never work in North America context. But it's an ongoing effort. So I came across a quote that Ronald Reagan had in 1979 as he was launching his political campaign, where he said, we'd be better off if Mexico and Canada, our neighbors, were stronger. And it's time that we stop thinking about our nearest neighbors as foreigners. Well, that's pretty different than the rhetoric that you've heard coming out of the Trump administration in the past years. And so when you take an issue like USMCA, which is the rewrite of NAFTA, you can look at it from different perspectives. One, I think probably one of the most significant ones is Trump wanted to get rid of NAFTA. The current Mexican president, Lopez Obrador, frankly, wouldn't have thought much of it either. But after 25 years, it was embedded in all three economies, so they couldn't really get rid of it. And the results are somewhat mixed. For example, the investment protections have actually been lessened. And those were an important part of NAFTA because they were a way of trying to encourage investment in Mexico and in effect to import the rule of law into Mexico. So the Mexican negotiators recognized this at the time. It was a way to try to secure investment provisions. There are provisions that are modernized in some of the data and digital areas. Interestingly, there's quite extensive now labor enforceability that allows actions against individual plants. And that'll be very interesting to watch for the Biden administration because it could either be used to strengthen the unions of Mexico, like NAFTA strengthened the economic institutions, or it could be used as a form of protectionism to block Mexican exports. So we'll see how that works out. So if you think about it today with the American public, and there's some similarities here with the Australian public, the top issues are probably topics such as immigration, organized crime and narcotics, environmental topics, economic integration, and those are all at the heart of your relationship with North America. I also think one of the points I try to draw out in the book is that we shouldn't just see North America in its regional context. I view North America as the continental base for the United States' ability to have power and influence globally. Because if you consider the prospect of 3 democracies, 500 million plus people, energy self-sufficiency, and ability to export, better demographics than the other countries in the rest of the world, if we see our people as human capital as opposed to a problem, and an integration of a developed and developing economies, you can see the potential that when you're looking at a China with 1.4 or India with 1.4 billion, you've got a different weight in the process. And so I see North America as an asset for American policy.
Moving on to one of your other principles, your third principle, the role of public support. Can you briefly explain the evolving role that foreign policy has had in US elections? And I'm asking this question in the context of Australia, where historically foreign policy has been a rather minimal issue in our elections. I think the only exception would be 2001 for obvious reasons, given the security challenges around the world. But foreign policy tends to play a very minimal role in our elections.
So it varies by times and events. And as I alluded to, however, it was part of the story for American politics from the start, because shortly after the American Revolution, you had the French Revolution. That really created the break between Jefferson and Hamilton and Washington and created the start of the two-party system. The expansion of North America was often a controversial issue. The Mexican War, 1846, 1847, bringing in Texas. This was often connected with the issue of slavery and the expansion in the southern states. There was an aspect that Australians might recognize. There was also a very strong anti-British tradition. That was a combination of our 2 wars with Britain, not only the Revolutionary War, but the War of 1812, sense of domination of Britain by financial issues. Migration of Irish Americans left a lot of hostility, German American community. So it was a challenge for Wilson to actually enter World War I. And then in the 1916 election, Wilson actually won with a motto of "He kept us out of war." And now, interestingly, if you look closely at the period, it was as much related to keeping us out of war with Mexico as it was the European war. But nevertheless, by 1917, Wilson is drawn into war. And then, in a sense, the disappointment after the failures at the Versailles Peace Conference and the breakdown in Europe led to a retreat in the United States. The high expectations of World War I led to a desire to return to normalcy in the 1920s. And then this led to the challenge for Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s. He's trying to push the United States towards a greater international position with the dangers from Nazi and Hitler and Imperial Japan. And then you've got Truman in the Cold War period, which is a very important aspect of American foreign policy. The sense of, quote, the loss of China and how that plays into sort of American politics all the way up to Vietnam. To give you a counterexample, I worked for President Bush 41, George H.W. Bush. He was quite successful in foreign policy, but when it came time for his reelection in 1992, it actually hurt him when we would have ads that would focus on or test ads about foreign policy. The public reaction was, yeah, we knew he was good internationally. Why can't he help us more at home? So it could play both ways. And of course, today, you've got the issues of the long wars of Afghanistan and Iraq. President Biden has decided to finally leave all forces, take all forces out of Afghanistan, China policy, trade policy. So I wouldn't suggest that foreign policy is the dominant strain in American politics, far from it. But at various points in the way that I said, it certainly has influenced the debate and how politicians position themselves.
I'm also quite keen to touch on a chapter on Secretary Root and his uphill battle to try and bring an international legal system, especially given the changing nature of the relevance we see in international law today and looking at some of the similarities in that chapter, but also the challenges we have today. Just quite keen for you to briefly reflect upon that.
So this was Elihu Root. He was Secretary of War and Secretary of State. And I included that chapter because I wanted to draw attention to the venerable but vexed tradition of international law and the American experience. And here, when I'm discussing law, I'm trying to talk about more broadly sort of rules-based systems, mediating institutions, the notion that it's not power politics alone. But because international law in some of our political debate has sort of been assailed as not being realistic enough, I wanted to emphasize that these people such as Charles Evans Hughes and Elihu Root at the start of the 20th century, these are very practical men. These were not utopians, and they understood the sense of power. They in part drew analogies to the formation of the United States itself, how law was and was part of the nation building exercise. And there's actually a deep set of historical experience. If you go back to our Declaration of Independence in 1776, you'll see references to the law of nations and a decent respect for the opinions of mankind. And the Declaration of Independence, written by Thomas Jefferson, is really an indictment. It's a legal indictment of George III. The Jay Treaty, which unpopular treaty that tried to also reconcile issues with Britain in 1795, was one of the first treaties, may have been the first treaty that included international arbitration of claims that were in disputes. In the early 1800s, I think it was 1817, there was something called the Rush-Badgett Treaty, which was with Britain about the border with Canada. It was the start of naval arms control that eventually led to disarmament across the Great Lakes. And after our Civil War, there were very important claims issued dealing with what are called the Alabama cases. These were raiders that really devastated the American merchant fleet that had been built in Britain. And there was an award, arbitration award given to the United States for the depredations. The challenge with the arbitration systems was the Senate always wanted to keep control over it. So it was hard for an executive branch to commit to an arbitration role. And what I've tried to extend to today is when we think about what international relations people call regimes, whether they be for trade or telecommunications or health or other issues. These are part of a rules-based system, and they're important whether they're for sharing information, lowering costs, building institutional capacity, sharing outlooks, mediating, and those will run today with issues ranging from trade to global climate change. There's a debate in the United States and elsewhere about how such systems work if you don't have shared political values. So if you're not basically democracies and open systems. But the reason I include this chapter was in part to emphasize the origins of those issues in the American experience and how they played out over time.
Moving on to your chapter with Secretary Cordell Hull, well, I know given your trade connection and how influential he was, especially in regards to encouraging FDR to pass the reciprocal trade agreement in 1934. Just reflect on how influential he was to the trade setup we have today.
So to understand this, one needs to recall that under the U.S. Constitution, the authority to raise or lower tariffs belongs with the Congress. And frankly, if you study U.S. domestic politics for the first 140 years, the tariff bills were the big legislative item, because in the end, in the 1930 bill, the Smoot-Hawley bill, there were over 3,000 items, set individual sort of amounts. And it became a log rolling exercise. So meaning that different parts of the country that wanted protection would agree to raise rates, and then the other would raise rates. I explained how, going back to the point about Hamilton, originally the tariff system was a revenue system. Up till the Civil War, or up to actually World War I, it provided almost 60% of the revenue. Then there was a movement towards restrictive policies in protectionism in the late 19th century. And then there was a movement towards reciprocity. So one would lower tariffs if the other would lower tariffs. The 1934 Act that you mentioned is fundamental in that history, because the Smoot-Hawley bill, 1930, raises the average U.S. tariff to about 59.1%. And then you get retaliation. So trade drops off, whether by value or volume, by 40 to 70%, and adds to the sort of calamity of the Great Depression. But in 1934, Hull, who is a former congressman and senator, manages to convince Roosevelt to proceed with what's only a 3-page bill. It's quite fascinating given the size of legislation today. But it does what people call a significant regime shift. It shifts the principal leading role on trade from Congress setting individual tariffs to giving the executive branch the authority to negotiate agreements. And at that time, it was just to cut tariffs up to 50%. And though its first bill, Congress didn't have to approve it. But that starts a 70 to 80-year-old tradition where Congress delegates the negotiating authority to the executive branch. Over time, this becomes what people in Australia and elsewhere would have heard as being sort of the fast track authority or trade promotion authority. And Congress actually votes on the bills with up or down votes. But Hull uses this authority to negotiate 31 agreements with 28 countries that not only lower tariffs, but probably even more importantly, each of those agreements includes principles such as most favored nation, non-discrimination, pushing barriers into tariffs so you could lower them. And that becomes the heart of the GATT negotiations in 1947. And then that goes on to create, eventually in the 90s, leads to the WTO. One important dimension of this is that this wouldn't have been possible except for the passage of the 16th Amendment in the United States in the early 1900s to allow the income tax, because you had to have some alternative revenue source. And you can see once you no longer rely so much on your tariffs for your revenue, you get more flexibility in being able to cut them. So for the next 80 years, this is basically the system with ebbs and flows until Trump really is the first American president that normally one looked to the executive branch to have a more national view than the individual members of Congress. But Trump uses this authority in a more protectionist fashion. And so one of the issues today we'll have to see is to what degree will the United States revert to a policy where the executive branch tries to promote liberalization or new rules internationally. And that's frankly an open question.
And you mentioned Trump, and that takes me to my next question. Is somebody else to take a leaf out of your book and write a similar publication around 250 years, how consequential do you think the Trump administration would be in the history of American diplomacy?
Well, one of the reasons that I actually only wrote up to the end of the Cold War, 1992, but then I included an afterword that focused on the 4 more recent presidents. But sometimes I think history needs a little time to settle. It has a certain political partisan sort of sharp edge at an early point. So in some ways it's too early to tell, but my own view is one fundamental difference was that Trump was very transactional. So what I've described, whether it's trade or alliances or North America policy, these are all to develop systems. And the idea that there is a benefit to the systems you develop beyond the individual case. Trump didn't take that approach. Everything was zero-sum, transactional. He also, frankly, was quite a bully, which is not an effective way to lead alliances. I think it's important to recognize that while foreign policy always reflects domestic policy, it's particularly the case with Trump because his foreign policy was an expression of his political base. So recall, he's trying to capture people's resentments and frustrations and be a disruptor. So notice how his policy towards Mexico and the wall is an expression of his anti-immigration policy. Similarly with his trade policy. And these become symbols of authenticity to his political base. And of course, associated with it is a huge narcissism and ego that in some ways found himself easier to deal with authoritarians than he dealt with other democratic leaders who had their own sort of politics to manage. I suppose one issue will be what its effect is on reliability of the United States. But this, of course, has to face another reality, which is what are the real options that others have? So if we think about Asia Pacific security or we think about European security, it's an expensive venture. And so if the United States returns to a more usual pattern, that, of course, I think will be met with appreciation and some recognition that you can't take the US for granted, which can cut both ways. It can lead countries to feel they need alternative options, whether they be Macron's notion of European autonomy, whether it be, in some cases, perhaps nuclear weapons. So we haven't really run the course of that yet. I think, obviously, and this is part of the story of the book, a lot depends on public attitudes. And what's quite interesting is if you look at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs or other surveys, the American public is not isolationist. Their support for trade and alliances and international engagement is actually quite high in the 60s and 70%, but it's inchoate. And that's always the question, is that what the role of president or political leadership will make in trying to shape those ideas. And that brings me back to one of the reasons I wrote the book. I'm trying to talk about the ideas and experience in the past and how leaders have dealt with this. And one other issue, Adil, is that, at the end of the day, people like to see things get done. And so it's not just the talk, but it's a question of effectiveness, whether it's dealing with security questions or economic recovery or pandemics or climate change. And that's a challenge in all democratic societies.
Moving on now to the section of the career highlights. Starting off with the World Bank presidency, you came in during a very difficult time. In July 2007, there was a leadership crisis. There was a culture issue within the bank. Can you help reflect on how you refocus the organization, especially given what happened the following year with GFC and trying to refocus for that event?
Yeah, that was an interesting challenge. As you noted, it was a revolutionary moment at the institution, which is quite uncommon for an international civil service. They managed to throw out the president with a complex story. And there's a lot of advice I got at the time about sort of having extensive discussions to calm people. I tried to do some of that, but I made a very important strategic judgment, and that is people had come to the bank because they were committed to the cause of development. And the sooner that I could get them refocused on that issue, probably the less time we would spend sort of hassling one another or in endless kumbaya sessions. And so I developed 6 themes, which I thought would cover the direction of the bank, not only in the near term, but longer term. One was the challenges of the very poorest countries, often in sub-Saharan Africa. A second is one that I know Australia's had an interest in, which is the particular challenges of fragile or post-conflict states, where the development has to be combined with governance and security. And given my experience, I'd seen different dimensions of this, and whether it was in sub-Saharan Africa or East Timor or sort of other parts of the world. A third one that's always a little unusual or controversial among some economists was the focus of middle-income states. So a pure economics approach would say you should just focus your energy and resources on the poorest because you've got scarce resources. My belief was we're trying to have the World Bank support a multilateral system. And so there were ways we needed to help middle income countries with their governance and their safety net programs and their investment and others, with the return idea that we also wanted middle income countries to contribute to the international system, whether it be trade or environment or other topics. So I'm a big believer that of course, you adjust what you do, but the development of countries in Latin America or some of the countries that Australia knows in Southeast Asia and others, Indonesia, it's important to make them successful participants in the international system. And then a fourth question is global public goods, whether they be trade, environment, or other issues today, biological security. Fifth, what draws all this together was the knowledge agenda. So that the bank, while it provides financial resources, its real strength is trying to connect knowledge and experience across different continents. And then the sixth, I was a little bit anticipating what became called the Arab Spring. From my work in the Arab world, I had a sense that there were brewing problems. And so I was trying to focus on the particular challenges of development in the Arab world. And so the basis of that was that there were some immediate things I had to fix. The issue of how to deal with corruption in a way that was seen as fair and transparent. I had former Fed Chairman Volcker actually chair a group that kind of tried to reconcile some of the procedural challenge you have to have as you do investigations. I created a special advisory group that actually involved Peter Costello, the former Australian treasurer I knew well, was sort of part of that process. I had to do fundraising for what's called IDA, or the IDA, which is for the very poorest, because it's either grants or long-term no interest sort of loans. And then, as you mentioned, within about a year, we had the global financial crisis, which was also a food price crisis. So we were positioned forward, fortunately, to be forward-leaning in that issue. So it's a fascinating institution. And most people really don't understand how the bank is run or kind of what its purposes are. So in that sense, the leadership challenge, both strategically and day by day, was a fascinating one.
No, the note you just raised in your last sentence about how many people aren't aware of what the bank does, the misleading use of the term bank. Just briefly explain what the role of the World Bank is and what it should be doing.
So one of the reasons it's poorly understood, I say in some jest but some seriousness, is because it's called bank. And most people assume that banks are there to either lend money, or at least they used to in the old days. And while if you look at all the World Bank's financing sources, so this is the traditional IBRD, long-term loans at low interest, IDA, which I mentioned for the poorest, IFC for the private sector, MIGA, which is the risk insurance. In a good year, it's $60 to $70 billion a year, which is no small amount, but it's a drop in the bucket compared to international capital markets. So the way that I looked at the bank was as a catalyst, as kind of a keynote in a network where, when it was most effective, we could do projects that helped countries either make reforms or transfer knowledge and experience. Interestingly, China from the start was one of the most effective in using World Bank programs as pilots, not so much for the money, but to get to experiment and experience with different types of programs and to learn from it and then expand it more globally. Or another example that I like to give is that Mexico in the 90s had come up with something called the Oportunidades program, which was a conditional cash transfer program. It was a safety net that gave money to the poorest people in Mexico, bottom 15 to 20%. The money actually went to the women head of households because it could show statistically it was more effective use. But there was a condition. They had to send their kids to school and they had to get health checkups. Probably did more for women's health in Mexico than anything in the history before that. But by the time I left the World Bank, we had expanded these in various forms to 45 other countries. Now, what was important about that is when we were trying to develop effective safety net programs for other countries, it wasn't just a question of here's the paper or here's the textbook. People could talk to the people in Mexico or then other countries to sort of see how it was done. What are the practical issues of it? So one of the things that was important, of course, would be whether you can use reforms and systemic changes to draw private capital, because you need to get private capital investment, want to have more effective uses. Some of that's simply local savings and being able to capture local savings, as many countries had done in East Asia, coordinate other aid players, because there's a lot of players. So in the case of Australia, for example, we had an office that was in Sydney that worked on some of the particular development problems of the Pacific Island states, which were both a development challenge and a security issue for Australia. And we worked with AusAid to try to design those, whether they be with communications issues or transport issues or sort of broadening the types of development or fisheries questions. So the bank is most effective when it can pull parties together, private sector, governments, civil society, other groups. And at the end, I suppose the most important part, Al, is that none of this works unless the country that you're working with owns it. So they have the development field had been littered with efforts by experts to try to bring outside knowledge and kind of force it down with countries. It doesn't work unless countries decide that they want to do this themselves. But the World Bank and others can play a big role in showing what's worked around the world and how to be most effective.
You spoke about in your answer about collaborating with China, and actually it was during the GFC you were able to find an effective way to collaborate with China in dealing with the crisis. And this is in addition to your famous quote as Deputy Secretary of State, where you asked China to become a responsible stakeholder. Can you reflect how you were able to bring China to the table at the time effectively? And what advice would you give to current policymakers in regards to U.S.-China relations and to improve them?
So it's probably useful, Adil, to start with the responsible stakeholder concept, which, as you mentioned, I gave in a speech in 2005, because the term is often used by people who haven't actually read the speech. The idea in 2005 was that by that point, China had been a member of the WTO, IMF, World Bank, UN Security Council, treaties from ozone depletion to arms control. And so what I was suggesting was that the goal of decades, which was to integrate China in the system, had been accomplished. And now the question was whether China would assume the responsibilities of the system. My logic was that the system that the US and others had created over the course of the post-war period had been very successful for China, helped this amazing growth story. But I was cautioning that unless China became a contributor to the system, whether it was for trade issues or environmental or other topics, that we'd have a hard time supporting it. So I never quite understood people who would be critical of it. I didn't say China was a responsible stakeholder. I said we needed to encourage it. And it didn't escape the Chinese that I was suggesting the United States would be the one who would judge this. But on the other hand, of course, I was treating China with respect and I was recognizing its accomplishments. And I was certainly suggesting that if China became a contributor, that obviously it would have some say in what the future rules would be. And this is important because there's a new conventional wisdom in the United States. I can't say to what degree it's been the view in Australia, that cooperation with China failed. And that's just totally wrong. Whether you look at, as you mentioned, the global financial crisis, China had, frankly, the biggest stimulus program. It moved from a 10% current account surplus to zero. That's some added demand. It stopped manipulating its currency. But I encountered this on issues dealing with non-proliferation, cooperation with Iran sanctions, environmental issues. Frankly, they helped me with Darfur when I was trying to deal with genocide in Sudan. Now, my point was not that everything was fine with China, far from it. And certainly under Xi Jinping, there's been a shift to further control of the Communist Party and the state. But I do think if people start with the assumption that you can't get any mutual gains with China, you're misreading history and you're going to push yourself in a dangerous direction. So I think you need a multifaceted policy. On the one hand, in security, you need deterrence policies, whether it's the South China Sea, East China Sea, dealing with Taiwan. And that will require alliance cooperation with, frankly, a different security and defense posture. There are areas where you're going to have mutual interests. How are you going to deal with climate change if you don't involve China? And frankly, how are you going to deal with biological security if we don't figure out ways to do so? Or issues in the international economy. And then there will be areas where you simply have to manage differences. Now, in saying this, I don't, I think for countries such as the United States and Australia, the story really has to start at home. So one of my differences with the Trump administration is that they seem to be almost trying to chase Chinese authoritarianism by closing off the United States, just as China closed itself off. I think that's a huge mistake. I mean, I think the United States and Australia's ultimate strength is our openness of societies, openness to goods, ideas, people, and we'll never be able to outcompete China by trying to exert controls. So, for example, for Chinese students, yes, you have to be careful about espionage, but I think it's a huge mistake for the United States to cut ourselves off from students from China and elsewhere. And this also is a question of competing in the long term over values. So I don't believe the United States should shrink from its position on freedom and liberties, but it's a question of how one does it. Reagan was quite skillful in holding out freedoms as an aspiration for the Soviet Union. Pompeo and others in the United States were trying to use freedom more as a club to insult China, and I don't think that's going to be effective with the Chinese public as well as with the government. And that means you have to design policies that kind of emphasize your values. So, for example, with Hong Kong, I'm not sure how much added gain you get by sanctioning various officials. I frankly would urge the United States to do what Britain has done, which is to say, open up opportunities for people from Hong Kong to come to the US if they need to. What better way to emphasize the differences between the two societies? So this is obviously going to be one of the huge challenges for your generation in policy. Yeah. Xi Jinping has clearly taken a lesson from the end of the Cold War, where the abandonment of the Communist Party, in his view, destroyed the Soviet Union. He believes his predecessors were too weak in dealing with corruption and Communist Party control. The state-owned enterprises seem to be strengthening their role. I think over the long term, this is not going to be a good thing for China. I think it'll, in the fields of innovation and technology, another topic I talk about in my book, I think that you need free societies have roles for mavericks, and mavericks are important in the field of innovation. So I think one needs to recognize China as it is, as opposed to how we wish it to be. But we also have to recognize that for a long-term challenge, you want to maintain the strengths of free societies and do so with your allies and partners.
So one of your many reforms was changing the governance structure to increase the influence of developing and emerging countries. So that is in addition to promoting senior officials from developing countries. How important was this in regards to having inclusive representation to making the organization more effective?
Well, if you go back to my principle for a multilateral institution, that you want to not only deal with the poorest countries, but middle-income countries, engage the developed countries in the support, you have to figure out a way to capture the interests of all the different parties. And my approach was to use multiple avenues to deal with this. So much of the focus at the time was simply on voting rights. But this was actually quite tricky because the bank very rarely takes votes. So they're more symbolic than they are sort of important in day-to-day decision making. And indeed, if you adjusted the voting rates based on size, China got more votes as it did, but sub-Saharan Africa would actually shrink, which doesn't really move in the right direction. So we did some change in voting, but one of the other changes that I made was we had a 24 seat board of it's an on-site board, and only 2 of the seats represented sub-Saharan Africa. So I actually added another seat for sub-Saharan Africa. But one also has to recognize the bank's a little different than the IMF in this side, in that it's not just a question of macroeconomics and size of the economy, but the bank runs a lot of trust funds and has this IDA support for the poorest. And so countries such as the Nordics, the Scandinavians, who are quite active in that area, justifiably perhaps wanted more available representation than you would have if it were simply done on the size of the economy. So that was a factor one had to take into account. So the Nordics have their own sort of chair on the board. But I also think the staffing issues was quite important, which you referenced, because that's the day-to-day effect of the institution. And I made a pretty strong effort that for the top 40 50 posts, I had not only half women, but half from developing countries. I brought in senior, the level below the president is managing director at the World Bank. One of my appointees is a Nigerian woman, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who's gone on to head the WTO. Another was Sri Mulyani from Indonesia, at that time prior had been finance minister and then has returned as finance minister. Another was an Egyptian reformer. And I looked for other appointments that could suggest this openness. So, for example, I appointed the first person from the developing world to be chief economist of the World Bank. And actually he was from China, Justin Lin. And I wanted to show kind of the openness that we had to sort of range of ideas. And it also can actually strengthen the institution. So I remember, for example, a meeting with the Vietnamese, and they were kind of at a key point in their reform process, and they were looking for some sort of confidence about moving forward with market reforms. And I could give them my answer, but I turned to Justin Lin, even recognizing Chinese Vietnamese sensitivities. And Justin could say, oh, you have to stick with the market. This is critical for your reform. It was better to hear from another developing country than a guy from a developed economy. So actually, one of the delightful things about the World Bank is we probably had people from 185 different countries. And they bring different perspectives and different experiences. And they share a common mission, which draws them together. But as an executive, you also have to learn that, for example, an Israeli may engage in debate different than an Indonesian woman. And so you have to sort of learn how to engage across the different cultures. But I found that to be both enjoyable and a strength of the institution. And then the last point, Adil, was there's a mindset, which is I've alluded to before, which was to treat developing countries as clients. So as opposed to imposing ideas from the developed world or sort of universities, I always tried to work with my staff to say, look, see your job as trying to solve problems with developing countries, recognizing they've got political economy constraints just like developed countries do, and that it's not a textbook solution. You have to customize for the needs. That actually requires some focus on the country teams and how they connect back with Washington and this knowledge transfer issue that I mentioned. So again, a lot of people really don't understand the executive roles in the bank are really a combination of economics, finance, sort of diplomacy, coordination, which also makes them interesting when done properly.
And on the note of bringing people to the table, very keen to touch upon this is your time as Undersecretary of State under Secretary Baker. You were there during a very pivotal moment in history, the end of the Cold War. You helped lead a U.S. delegation on German reunification, which you won an award for from the German government. Reflect on what that period of time was like and how you were able to get the much desired result.
Well, one of the sort of impressions that I share with people is it's very hard to predict future events, but you can often anticipate developments. And we were fortunate in 1989, early on. You could see that the ice of the Cold War was breaking, and it actually created some challenges in Germany, which was on the front line. You just had the negotiation of the double-zero intermediate range missiles, eliminating them, which left only short-range missiles. NATO was going to modernize those missiles, but as the Germans said, the shorter the missiles, the better the Germans. So you had this challenge from the start about how you deal with these short-range forces. But I'd say in the 89-90 period, U.S. diplomacy worked on two tracks. One was a historical, just as we've talked about in the book, recognition that beyond the issue of Russia, there was the German question. So the German question, ever since Germany had been unified in 1871, was how do you deal with this power in the center of Europe without natural borders? And we went through 2 world wars to deal with that. You had 2 German states. And so, frankly, the lesson from the Cold War period was to embed the West German state in European and transatlantic institutions. So the strategy flowing from the history was you wanted to unify Germany within the Western institutional structure, including the NATO alliance, which was to give assurance to neighbors west and east, and for Germany sort of embedded as a European state. But at the same time, you had to have a a fingertip feel for the facts on the ground. So recall, the people of the East were moving to the West. This created a momentum, which on the one hand could have been disruptive if the international powers had resisted it. Who knows what would have sort of broken out. On the other hand, we figured we could use that momentum to push some of the recalcitrant countries, obviously the Soviet Union, but also Britain and France for a time, to accept the notion of German unification. And then we took the strategy and the momentum on the ground and connected with what we called the 2+4, the negotiating process. And so, what's quite interesting is all this happened within 10 or 11 months, if you think how long it takes for diplomacy to do something today. And we always were uncertain whether the window would close. We didn't know whether there'd be a coup in the Soviet Union. Germany was unified in October of 1990. By December, Shevardnadze, the Soviet foreign minister, resigns. The next year, you've got a coup against Gorbachev. And so the clock was always ticking. At the same time, we tried to proceed in a way that brought the parties together. The one last point, again, with a historical analogy, was that we had we tried to avoid what we call the Versailles victory. And what we mean by that was an accord or an agreement that plants the seeds of its own destruction, as in our view, the Versailles Treaty did over the course of the decades of the 20s and 30s. Part of that dealt with Germany. So I was actually even more ardent than the Germans about avoiding what we called singularization, or you would say discrimination, which still would, with the idea that you didn't want to have limits on German sovereignty, because you didn't want to have some future generation of Germans say, well, why are we being treated differently? Now, in 1990, that might have seemed like a crazy idea. But if you think about developments in Europe over the past 30 or so years, you could see you get different political forces. So this is another example of trying to apply history to a practical challenge. Then the other issue, of course, is what one deals with the Soviet Union, or what becomes Russia. And here you had the challenge that it was going through its own internal revolution. The Soviet Union, of course, sort of breaks up. But we tried with issues of border or economics or security arrangements to give, at that time, the Soviet Union, later Russia, a place within the European order. But that's a challenge that will persist to today.
And we're just about to approaching time, so we're heading to the last question now. How much of an influence was Secretary Baker to your career, and in terms of his diplomatic achievements, what would you say was his biggest legacy?
Well, it was a huge opportunity to work for someone who is skilled and as talented as he is. At heart, he represents one of the themes in the book, which is a pragmatism. So more than any other person that I can imagine, we were always focused on results, whether we're going to get things done. Baker had an astute sense of power. Foreign powers wanted to be his friend. They certainly didn't want to be his enemy. He wasn't blunt or bullying about it, so he was often described as the iron fist in the velvet glove. But it also meant that we were always focused, as this discussion has showed, not just on the high concept, but the institutions, the processes, the votes. How do you make things happen? And obviously, for him and for President Bush, the end of the Cold War in Europe, the Gulf War coalition, Israeli-Arab negotiations, beginning that process were historic points. What people often overlook is there actually were the foundation stones for much of U.S. foreign policy for the next decade. So you had the creation of APEC with Australia in 1989, which was an economic creation in addition to the security zones. You had NAFTA, which I referred to. You had the Uruguay round and the creation of the WTO. We had Central American Peace Accord. As a boss, it was quite unusual in that I was pretty young when I started working for him. I was in my 30s. But his approach was always basically, if you could perform and help with these results, understand how to get things done. He didn't really care where you were from, what your background was. You could always take on more responsibility as long as you didn't give up that you had. And I suppose one of the other parts that was appealing was, there's some people, if you stay up to 2 a.m. to write talking points for the next day, they just ignore them and it's kind of a downer. But Baker would always go with them, make them better, use them. And so that created sort of an incentive for it. he has an inner confidence, which also at times can be a self-centeredness, which was we didn't spend a lot of time palling around or having to have emotional friendships of things. We developed bonds from the association, but it was basically always things were focused on what we were to get done. And I think that gave him a confidence where he didn't mind, where he had people like me who were a generation younger that could contribute or debate or offer ideas. And one other aspect that I think people haven't looked at as much, but as I've reflected on it, is we would create teams. And so one of the aspects, I would always bring in other talent that I could find. And I suppose one of the reasons I was confident doing that was I wasn't having to compete for my position with Baker. I knew my position with Baker. And I always felt if I could bring in other talent, whether the career foreign service or other ideas, that would make us stronger as a group. So I was very fortunate to have him as a boss. And it leads me to a point, Adil, which is when younger people say, what advice do you give? I often say, pick your boss. And they find this a little odd because, of course, they think the boss picks them, which is true. But on the other hand, what I'm meaning by this is try to work for somebody who you feel you can learn from and contribute to. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to agree with them all or take every parts of their personality, but see it as an opportunity. And something that helped me was that I got myself in the mindset of not necessarily thinking what I wanted to do, but what would help Baker with his job. And what that meant was I was starting to think like the decision maker. And the more you start to think like the decision maker, there's a greater chance you'll probably become one in your own right. So and Baker, at age 90 today, remains very, very sharp, very active, and has good advice.
Ambassador Zoellick, thank you so much for your contribution to this episode. We really appreciate your insightful advice and we're very grateful for this opportunity.
Thanks for having me, Alan.